Chapter 7 is legal, ethical, and tax issues, and there's a lot of content here, so I'm going to try to be as efficient as I can. But point number one, this first, and probably the majority dealing with laws in e-commerce. The first issue is, or thing to remember, is that any business, whether you're a brick and mortar or an e-commerce, must comply with the same laws and regulations and face the same set of penalties. So, regardless of what kind of business you are, you still have to follow the same laws. The only complication is that your boundaries extend beyond your physical presence. If you are a mom and pop with a little sandwich shop in Bangor, Maine, well, you comply with the laws in Maine and in Bangor, and that's pretty much it. But when you're selling stuff across state lines, across international boundaries, it gets a little bit more complicated. So let's see what we got here. Okay, just a few resources that are kind of interesting, but you can look at that on your own. The first concept is called jurisdiction. Probably most of you have heard about this. Jurisdiction means who has power over you. And, again, in the physical world, if I have a sandwich shop in Bangor, then the laws of Bangor have jurisdiction over me. The laws of Maine have jurisdiction over me. And so, that's pretty easy. You know that when you cross the border into New Hampshire, then you have to follow New Hampshire law. They have jurisdiction over you. So that's pretty easy. But then you have to figure out which laws you have to comply with when you have an e-commerce business. And let me keep going here, because basically, again, if you're in Maine, you follow Maine laws. If you're in China, you follow China laws. Okay. But it gets more complicated. So there's a couple of types of jurisdiction to understand. The first one is called subject matter jurisdiction, and that's actually pretty intuitive. That means let's say, if you're dealing with taxes, then the U.S. tax court has jurisdiction over subject matter that's related to taxation. If you're dealing with bankruptcy issues, the bankruptcy court has the authority to deal with issues related to bankruptcy. They all have, it's the subject matter, whether it's bankruptcy or tax. And then for commerce, the subject matter, you follow the Federal Trade Commission about laws in commerce. So that's subject matter jurisdiction. The other one is personal jurisdiction, and here there's something, this long arm statute creates personal jurisdiction over non-residents. So as a U.S. citizen, even though if you, and I assume this is still true, I don't know, but even if it's legal to purchase certain drugs in Mexico, if it's not legal in the U.S., then even if you're in Mexico as a U.S. citizen, you are not allowed to purchase them. However, so my son is actually an attorney. He's got his own practice here in Bangor, and he has talked to my e-commerce classes a few times. So I'm going to try to remember what he said. Actually, one thing he said is that if you're ever in doubt, hire an attorney, because it's so complicated. But one thing I do remember that he really stressed was that if you're an e-commerce business, anywhere that you sell your products, you have to follow the laws. So let's say you're selling little moose toys. Well, if you sell them in Maine, you follow Maine law. If you sell them to someone in New Hampshire, you have to follow New Hampshire law. If you sell them to someone in New Mexico, you have to follow New Mexico law. So anywhere that you're doing business, you have to follow the laws of those states. And then in terms of consumers, sometimes to protect yourself, you can put a clause into your website saying that if there's any issues, any disputes, that consumers agree to follow Maine laws. And so here's an example. The terms of use shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Washington with regard to its conflict of laws, rules, da-da-da. So anyway, that's something you can do. It's probably not cast in stone, but at least, if you want to try to protect yourself as an e-commerce business, you can put one of those clauses in there. So again, you have to follow the rules of anywhere you do business. What about international? We just finished the international e-commerce chapter. Well, there's something called judicial comity, enforcing other countries' laws out of a sense of comity or friendly civility. So Comity refers to legal reciprocity, the principle that one jurisdiction will extend certain courtesies to other nations, particularly recognizing the validity and effect of their executive, legislation, and judicial act. Okay, so, again, since we have a lot of comity, especially with our major trading partners, then, we will recognize each other's laws. So you have to recognize that. However, we also have treaties that deal with international e-commerce, and so here the Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, and then there was basically an e-commerce convention to provide uniform rules to facilitate international trade, especially with countries that did not have those laws. So there's a lot of treaties and so on, and again, it gets very complicated. So you can put clauses on your website. Hopefully you won't get into conflicts. You need to be sure to follow the laws of the countries you're selling in. So again, remember from the last chapter, remember that if you're selling products in France, they require that all your websites be in French or you're breaking their laws. Remember in the Arab countries, there's certain laws about what you're allowed to show in terms of bare skin and all kinds of laws. So the point is you have to follow their laws if you're going to sell there, and you better do your homework. And it might be a good idea if you're going to do this a lot to have lawyers who can help you get out of trouble. Okay, a couple more resources. So conflict of laws. Which laws have precedence? Well, as I understand it, federal law takes priority over state law, which takes priority over local laws. That's as I've always heard it. Okay. So the next thing is culture and ethics. Laws are formed because of our culture, because of our society, because of what we consider important. We have laws against theft and killing people and deception, and so our culture shapes our laws, and so we should recognize that different cultures have different norms and values, and so their laws are shaped by their culture, so we have to look at those as well. I found this little statement here at the bottom online. I don't really know how true it is, but they say here that if you're dealing with a Muslim culture, that Sharia law is, law and culture, law and religion are kind of one and the same, and that influences their laws. So for whatever that's worth, some of you may know more and can put that in the discussion forum. Let's see. So laws, jurisdiction and laws mean that you know who has power over you. We talked about all that. Legitimacy is that you recognize that, let's say, Maine law has power over you, and that's a legitimate form of power, and you agree to that. Constructive notice is that for example, that when you're in Maine, you have to follow Maine laws. When you drive over the border into New Hampshire, there's a big sign saying entering New Hampshire, and you've kind of been given constructive notice that you're crossing over the border, so that you have to follow New Hampshire law. And of course, that's a little bit more difficult in e-commerce. But anyway, okay, that just to keep things brief. That's kind of the essence of some major laws. Contracts are another major issue to consider in e-commerce, and there's three parts of a contract: the offer, the acceptance, and the consideration. So let me scroll down to here. In e-commerce, the way this works is the offer is that you, as an e-commerce seller, are offering to sell a product. The buyer, wait, let me go back here. Okay, offer, acceptance, and consideration. Okay, so that's the offer. The acceptance is when you, as the buyer, click on add to cart. And then the consideration is when you accept their payment, so that validates the contract. Okay, that's pretty intuitive. Okay, let's see. User must accept the contract. Okay, so I'll keep going here. Okay, terms of service agreements are what you agree to. The issue here is that there's all kinds of terms of service where you don't read the fine print. None of us reads the fine print. Maybe some, but many. I never do. even though we should, but we don't. But the fine print may say something like, well, by by purchasing this product, you are agreeing to our terms of service, which means that nothing is refundable, and you cannot sue us, and whatever. So there's all kinds of clauses in there. So in the contract, in theory, we should all read our contracts and be a little bit more observant. So this is something that's interesting. Contracts, you can form a contract by email, by talking on the telephone. As long as it's not over $500, you don't need a written signed contract. A written signed contract is only for the sale of goods or services, I think, over $500, and actions that cannot be completed within 1 year. So like a long-term service contract that's more than 1 year. So that's something good to know. Implied warranties. An implied warranty is a promise to which the seller can be held even though the seller did not make explicit statements. And that has to do with, for example, in Maine, I don't know the exact details, but in Maine we have some sort of a lemon law. So that, and this is kind of a buyer beware thing, because a lot of people, like if you go into Best Buy and they say to you, oh, well, here you're buying this TV, purchase this extended warranty for three years for an extra $200. As I understand it, don't hold me to this, but I believe I've heard my son say that in Maine with our lemon law, that we don't need those extended warranties because Maine law says that you have a warranty on certain products for a certain amount of time. And there are things like that on the web with these implied warranties. So if you are worried about it, you can put other statements on your website about your warranty and all that kind of stuff. For example, here's a disclaimer statement. We disclaim all warranties, including infringement, all kind of legal stuff. But you can put these statements on there if you are worried about protecting yourself from frivolous suits and things like that. Okay, so let's keep going here. Okay, intellectual property is the other huge thing on the web. As we all know, the web is so easy to find things and it's so easy to copy and paste. But if it is intellectual property, which includes copyright, trademarks, and patents, then you can't do that, because by law, if you create something, an intellectual property of your own, people can't just use it. So the difference is copyright. Let's say you create an original content on the web. You write a beautiful poem and you publish it on the web. Where is that? Here. U.S. law, work created, let's say your poem, work created after 1989 is copyrighted automatically by virtue of copyright law. So when you publish something on the web, it is automatically copyrighted, and by law, copyright law, no one can use that without your permission. Okay, so that's copyright. And however, those of us in education, we have something. One exception to that is fair use, and here's the fair use code. So what that means is that in education we can use content for educational purposes only, not for commercial purposes. In theory we should get permission, but we don't. Not everybody does, but fair use is kind of a big thing. Let's see. Okay, so then patents. Patents are inventions that you make, and that's a long, expensive, complicated process. And so, if you have an idea that's original, you want to make money on it, you should patent it. And then trademarks, like the Disney logos, the arches of McDonald's, and so on. Trademarks you cannot use without permission. And some companies like Disney are famous for having web crawlers across the whole internet looking for unauthorized use, and you will get a letter from their lawyer saying, remove this or we will sue you. So you have to be careful of that. Domain names used to be big business, where people would buy up all these domain names like Ford.com, Disney.com, before people knew about the web so much, and then sold them as a business, and or held them hostage, like celebrities. Somebody would buy up BradPitt.com and then try to sell that back to him for lots of money. So there were laws that were passed, these anti-cyber squatting laws that keep people from doing that, because that was really getting out of hand. Okay, so then, okay, digital watermarks are codes you can put in your website so that you can track it and monitor it. Defamation is another thing, and that's, my son was saying that that is actually difficult, because so how do you know when you're defaming somebody or not? Well, let's see here. Let's see, FTC. Okay, here we go. Social media, especially with social media, it gets really hard. So, public comments on media, blogs, social media, and so on. It depends on your state. Again, different states have different laws. Here's some examples of defamation. Let's see. If you say you are that John Smith hit his wife 2 weeks ago, if the statement is not true, it's defamatory. But if you say, I think that John Smith hit his wife 2 weeks ago, they're not statements, it's your opinion. So anyway, this is just kind of interesting. It gets complicated, but you have to be careful of that. Okay. All right, moving on. All right. Deceptive trade practices is covered by the Federal Trade Commission. You know, you can't, by law, advertise one thing and do something else, the bait and switch. There's all kinds of deceptive practices that are regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. So be careful of that. Here we go, bait and switch, endorsements that are not true, I don't know, warranties that aren't true, all kinds of stuff. Okay, next thing, online crime, that theft, stalking, pornography, distribution, gambling, and so on and so forth. I mean, that is absolutely huge. Apparently, what I've read somewhere, that the two biggest revenue sources on the web are pornography and gambling, which is pretty sad commentary, but anyway. There's also cyber stalking, cyber bullying, sexting. There's some examples of that. Let's see. All kinds of new innovative things coming out with online cyber crime. Oops, sorry. Let's see. There's one here I wanted to show you. Cyberbullying. Maine actually has some laws about cyberbullying, because there's a huge, actually, we unfortunately had something happen in our own MBS family and found out that cyberbullying, which leads to children committing suicide, is like twice the national average in Maine. So, you know, that online bullying is absolutely huge and horrible, and so there are laws to help mitigate that. Let's see, okay. Here's some examples of cyber laws. Cyber pornography, tampering with code, digital evidence, and so on. Here's cyber stalking, bullying, child pornography. There's all kinds of laws, copyright, and so on. So it's evolving. You know, as the internet evolves, then laws are evolving also. Cyber terrorism is also becoming huge. The FBI director, James Comey, well, used to be now, had said on several occasions that cyber terrorism is the greatest threat to our national security. And this was an NPR segment I heard about a week or so ago about cyber terrorists and how they are developing their own channels, social media channels that that nobody knows about, because Facebook and Twitter are trying to shut them down. But there's one that they developed. It was called where is it? It was called Telegram. That they developed their own social media channels to communicate, and so you know, that's a big issue. Ethics, of course, cyber and ethics. Here's some ethical issues that IT professionals face. Should you read the private email of your users because you can? Is it okay to monitor websites? Should you keep logs of what people do online? Key logging machine, is it good to read documents? Let's see. So, you know, you have access to a lot of data, so it's very easy to violate privacy and so on. Let's see. Okay. you know, one thing is that you should have policies, informed consent. If you're going to monitor your employees, you have to let them know that they're going to be monitored, that you're going to record what they're doing on their computers, that you're going to keep track of what they do on their social media and so on. So, people have rights, organizations have rights, there's different laws guiding privacy rights, and there's also differences. One thing that's very interesting is that here in the U.S., companies have the right. It's not illegal to collect consumer behavior, so we have what's called opt out. So if, as a consumer, if you do not want them to collect your data and sell it, you have to actively opt out of that practice. But in Europe, it's the opposite. It is illegal to collect consumer data and sell it, and so people have to proactively opt in and give companies permission to collect their data. So it's very different. It's interesting. And that's why they, Big Brother, know everything about us. Okay. Communications with children, we have pretty good laws about that. But again, the cyberbullying is huge and, perhaps needs to evolve even more. Okay. And then finally, to wrap this up, taxation. Taxation on the web can be really complex. Laws are evolving where in the old days people bought a lot on the web because if it was not in your state, then you would not have to pay tax on it in theory. So the idea was in the early days of the internet and e-commerce that they wanted to kind of nurture e-commerce and give them a little bit of an advantage. So if I bought something from Amazon and Amazon did not have a presence in Maine, I would not have to pay tax. Now in theory, many states had use taxes so that you were supposed to voluntarily, when you did your taxes, tell the Maine state government, oh, I bought $1,000 worth of stuff on the internet and I'm going to pay you 5% on that, so I owe you $50. A lot of people didn't do that. Now it's changing. Many states are actually requiring online retailers to collect tax, and so you have to find software that will do that for you to automate that process. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Oh, and if you're dealing with countries, you have to pay. There's tariffs and taxes and import duties and all kinds of stuff that you have to look at as well. So that gets back to doing your due diligence, and understanding tax law, complying with tax law, finding the right software to help you do it, and so on. And so on that note, we will call it a wrap, and I look forward to seeing you in the discussion